Chapter 661 To commemorate the fallen. Cecilia exclaimed with panic, "It seems that our enemies are going to entrap us. What should we do?" Tom explained, "Don't panic. We'll just have to take a detour since the main route is blocked. We'll talk about it when we get to the station." Sherry added, "That's right, let's retreat for now. It would be bad if they spotted us. We'll have to go through a different path." Everyone nodded their heads in agreement and carefully retreated before they were spotted. They had just turned around when they caught sight of a group of people. The four of them were all stunned by the sight. Cecilia started to panic once more. "We're surrounded. They're on both our front and backs." Tom immediately said, "Hurry up and retreat to the side. They won't be able to find us if we hide in the forest on the mountain." Sherry replied, "Yeah, let's go." Nothing good would happen once those men caught them. The four of them got off the road and entered the forest. They didn't dare to slow down all the way until they reached halfway up the mountain. Cecilia said while panting for air, "Where do we go now?" Tom explained, "Let's just stay here for now. We'll look for a bus in the morning." Sherry replied, "I'm afraid we can't get a ride." "Why not?" Tom asked. Sherry replied, "The Jessups will already be anticipating that we leave Turin by bus and have placed their men around the bus stations. We'll be caught as soon as we arrive." Tom nodded his head in agreement, and then slumped down as he was at a loss for what to do next. Sherry asked, "Let's just stay here until tomorrow. They won't be so insane as to attack us in broad daylight, right?" Tom nodded his head. "Yeah, we'll stay here for tonight then." The Jessups and Celian's men were unable to find Tom and the rest at the foot of the mountain. The four of them remained at the midpoint of the mountain and would only leave by the next morning. Fergus and Lacey stayed behind at the abandoned factory and waited. They waited for a very long time, but Tom and his friends were nowhere to be seen. Fergus angrily shouted, "What's going on? Why is it taking them so long to catch four people? Bunch of losers!" Lacey started to panic. "Call and tell them to bring the four of them to us as soon as possible. We're in trouble if we can't find them before dawn." "Could they have left Turin?" "Impossible. They may be quick, but it's impossible for them to leave Turin in such a short amount of time. Besides, there's not a lot of buses running around during this time." "Then, where did they go?" Lacey explained, "They must have noticed that something was off and hid themselves in some corner. We have to capture them no matter what." Fergus replied, "Yeah, I'll have my men continue the search." The next day, at Southlake City, the remembrance ceremony was about to begin. Alongside the ceremony was a rally to inspire the Diatoran citizens of a more peaceful future. Caspian also wanted to publicly execute the archers and the Hudsons who had committed treason against Diatoran. Caspian, along with Willow and Zoe, had woken up early for the occasion. He brought Macy and his armored soldiers to the west of the city to collect the ashes of their fallen comrades before heading toward the Southlake City Memorial Hill. Balthazar was also present at the hill, alongside Benjamin and John. They were all waiting to welcome the country's heroes. The king's arrival also meant that the entire hill was surrounded by Diatoranian soldiers, rendering the premise impossible for ordinary civilians to approach. The soldiers were to protect the king, as there were still plenty of enemy special agents lurking within the country. Zoe couldn't follow Willow to the memorial hill. She could only witness the memorial taking place from the outskirts of the hill with the other civilians. The weather was foggy as Caspian and his armored soldiers escorted the ashes of their comrades toward the memorial hill. It started to drizzle halfway through their journey. Caspian and Willow were sitting on the tanks at the front. The rest of the tanks in the long convoy were escorting the patriots. Citizens of Southlake City had already prepared for the memorial for some time. They stood by both sides of the road in the rain. Everyone held flowers in their hands while wearing black armbands on their shoulders. Some even held up banners to thank and commemorate the fallen soldiers for defending the country. The citizens stood in an orderly manner as they lowered their heads in silence to mourn the soldiers who had died in battle. Meanwhile, at the Stewart residence, Donald exclaimed with panic, "Henry is going to get executed today, Mom. We need to save him." Melinda also eagerly voiced her agreement. "He's right, Mom. We can't just watch as Henry gets executed, can we?" Marilyn was put under immense pressure. She had been doing everything she could to save Henry for the past few days. But it was almost impossible to save Henry now that he was branded as a traitor to the country. Caspian would be executing Henry himself, and the Stewarts could hardly get in contact with him. Marilyn explained, "I heard that His Majesty will also be present at the Memorial Hill. We can perhaps ask him to spare Henry's life." There had been an abnormal number of soldiers stationed around Jade Dragon Grand Hotel in the past few days, and everyone had assumed it was to protect the king. Coupled with the fact that the hotel was attacked, they were sure that it was the king himself who was in Southlake City. Donald asked, "But how can ordinary civilians like us have a chance to meet with the king?" Melinda chimed in, "So what if we can have an audience with the king? I don't think His Majesty would even spare the time for us." Marilyn explained, "We're technically part of Caspian's family. There's a chance that His Majesty would allow us to speak to him." Donald seemed hopeless. "I don't think it's going to work. His Majesty might just order for our entire family to be killed once he learns that Henry had committed treason." Marilyn's expression soured. "We don't have much choice. Asking for the king to spare him would be the che for Henry to survive." They had no other options left but a risky last-ditch effort. Carl nodded his head. "We'll have to try." Marilyn replied, "Let's go to the Memorial Hill now. We might still be able to reach the king in time." "All right." The stewards immediately got into their car and drove to the Memorial Hill. Meanwhile, at the Memorial Hill, Balthazar and his soldiers had been waiting for the arrival of the fallen soldiers. The soldiers stood on both sides of the road with a solemn expression. Caspian and his men soon arrived at the hill. Balthazar announced, "In memory of our fallen brothers." The soldiers immediately saluted. Chapter 662 Last Struggle. The tanks escorting the ashes of the fallen were parked within the Memorial Hill. Soldiers carefully retrieved the urns and stood in an orderly fashion. The entire hill was also decorated with wreaths and celebratory banners. Citizens of Southlake City followed behind the tanks as they reached the outskirts of the hill, ready to see off the fallen soldiers. They, however, weren't allowed to enter the Memorial Hill itself. They could only remain outside and watch from outside the iron railings. The citizens could only look at their king from a distance. All of the soldiers lowered their heads and remained silent for 3 minutes. Caspian then delivered a speech of condolence as the Diatoranian god of war. The speech would also mark the beginning of the remembrance ceremony. Countless wreaths and banners were brought onto the Memorial Hill. Meanwhile, several heavily armored vehicles transporting the traitors also drove into the place. Inside the car were the Hudsons, the Archers, and Henry. It was time for their execution after they committed treason. The schedule included executing them by firing squad as a way of appeasing the fallen soldiers. The stewards soon arrived outside the Memorial Hill. They wanted to head inside to look for Caspian but were stopped by the soldiers at the entrance. They didn't dare to cause a commotion, given that the ceremony had just begun. The stewards knew that causing trouble now would only anger the king, making pleading for Henry's life impossible. All they could do now was patiently wait outside the Memorial Hill. The ceremony would take about an hour. "Bring in the traitors! We'll gun them down and honor our fallen brothers with their blood," Caspian shouted. Following his orders, the armored vehicles drove toward him. The stewards started to panic as they realized that the execution was about to begin. The Hudsons, the Archers, and Henry himself were brought upon the crowd. The traitors were horrified as they saw the urns. They began to panic as they looked around and saw nothing but soldiers with solemn expressions staring back at them. Various big shots were present as well, such as Caspian, some senior officers, and even Balthazar. They had never expected to be publicly executed. The Hudsons, the Archers, and Henry had never once seen the king in the flesh. They would have felt extremely honored to be around Balthazar if they had met in normal circumstances. But now, Balthazar was there to execute them. The stewards were horrified as they watched Henry being brought out. They wanted to head inside the Memorial Hill and beg Balthazar for mercy. But with the Memorial Hill completely surrounded by soldiers, no one dared to make a move. They decided to wait for the chance to arrive. Meanwhile, Grant, Richard, and the rest of the Hudsons and the Archers were placed in front of the urns of the fallen soldiers. Caspian shouted, "You shameless traitors! Do you acknowledge the crimes you've committed?" They were horrified and were unable to give Caspian a reply. Henry was so frightened that his legs were shaking. Growing up, he had always been pampered and had never been in such a horrifying scene. He could feel death creeping up his neck. But it was too late for regrets. Grant begged, "Please spare us, Lord Caspian. We, the Hudsons, promised to turn over a new leaf for the better." Lawrence joined in as well. "Lord Caspian, please spare us the Archers as well. We will sincerely repent for our crimes." Caspian's expression turned sour as he shouted, "Our soldiers had died in battle, fighting off enemies that you had helped bring upon our own land. Do you think they would ever forgive you? Letting you live would be forsaking all of my men who had died protecting our country. Do you really think we could ever forgive you after what you've done?" Grant explained, "We're innocent, Lord Caspian. We had no choice but to allow the enemies to take over our residence when they invaded Southlake City. We never wanted to betray Diatoran. Lawrence chimed in. He's right. We would have been killed if we never complied with the enemy's demands. We had no choice but to pretend to defect to the enemies in order to survive. Caspian shouted, "You won't be fooling me with those lousy excuses of yours. I already found out that you've been working for the enemy before they even entered Southlake City." Both Grant and Lawrence fell silent. Nicholas sheepishly explained, Lord Caspian, I understand that we've not been on good terms, but as the Diatoranian god of war, you can't just execute us because of your personal grudge. Caspian replied, Nicholas, you, alongside Richard and Henry, had secretly colluded with Kenzie, the leader of the enemy special agents, and began to spread rumors to slander my reputation. You've also caused immense chaos within Southlake City as a result. I have all the evidence at hand. It would be a disservice not to execute all of you here and now and prevent scums like you from endangering the citizens of Diatoran ever again. The next moment, Balthazar spoke up. That's enough, Caspian. You shouldn't waste any more time trying to reason with them. Execute them immediately. The Hudsons, the Archers, and Henry all had almost fainted from shock as Balthazar himself ordered their execution. Caspian was also done with talking to the traitors. Of course. I hereby announce the execution of the traitors, and I hope their blood can appease our fallen brothers. The traitors to their own country deserve to die. Caspian waved his hand as dozens of soldiers raised their guns and aimed at the traitors. The Hudsons and the Archers were horrified as they looked at the muzzles of the guns pointed at them. The Stuarts were similarly horrified as they watched the scene unfold. They had expected the trial and questioning to take much longer, and were caught by surprise when they saw that the guns were raised at them. Marilyn shouted as she rushed toward the memorial hill, "Don't shoot! Let me speak with His Majesty, please." Melinda also tried to rush inside. "Please don't kill my son! He didn't do anything!" The Stuarts shouted as they tried to break into the place. The soldiers stationed by the entrance had stopped them from entering. Within the memorial hill were all sorts of big shots, including Balthazar. The Stuarts would never be allowed inside. The Stuarts' shouts echoed throughout the silent memorial hill and garnered the attention of everyone there. Both Caspian and Balthazar heard their shouts as well. Henry looked over to the voice of his family to find them outside the memorial hill. His tears began to flow down his cheeks as all sorts of emotions ran through his heart. Balthazar asked, "Who are those noisy bunch of people?" Chapter 663, Begging for Mercy. Caspian stepped forward and explained, "They're the Stuarts, who are also my in-laws, Your Majesty." Balthazar was puzzled. "Oh, your in-laws?" He had already guessed the relationship between Caspian and Logan, but the father and son had yet to recognize each other. Just who else would Caspian refer to as family? Caspian explained, "It's because I took on the Stuart family's name when I got married, Your Majesty. You can consider them as my family." Balthazar asked, "I get it. But why are they causing a commotion now when we're about to execute the traitors?" Caspian replied. "One of the traitors before us is part of the Stuart family." "There's a traitor among the Stuarts." Balthazar was shocked as he had been busy with political affairs and had no idea that Henry was part of the traitors. Caspian sounded helpless. "That's right. I'm very troubled by this fact as well. As the Diatoranian god of war, he felt embarrassed that one of his in-laws was a traitor to the country." Balthazar asked, "Which one of the traitors is the Stuart family member?" Caspian pointed at Henry and explained, "It's him, Henry Stuart. He's my wife's cousin." Henry lowered his head and remained silent out of fear. Balthazar was surprised. "Do you want to execute him as well, Caspian?" Caspian would no longer be welcomed by the Stuarts if he were to execute one of their family members. He explained, "I won't forgive him for committing treason, and I won't allow my own relationship with the guilty to cloud my judgment." Balthazar praised him. "You truly are a righteous man, Caspian. I'm impressed. Let me in. I need to speak with His Majesty." "You can't kill Henry, Caspian. Your Majesty, Henry never committed treason." The Stuarts continued to shout at the top of their lungs from outside the memorial hill. Balthazar said, "Why don't you talk to them, Caspian? They seem really desperate." Caspian was surprised. "But they're merely ordinary citizens, Your Majesty. Do you really wish to allow them inside?" He never expected that Balthazar would ask him such a question. Balthazar replied, "They're not merely ordinary citizens as they're your in-laws. I'd like to hear what they have to say about Henry's crimes." Caspian answered, "As you wish, Your Majesty, I'll let them in." He didn't dare to refuse Balthazar's request. Caspian then turned to one of his armored soldiers. "Relay my orders." Let the stewards enter the memorial hill. Yes, sir. The armored soldier immediately ran off to relay the message. The stewards continued to shout at the top of their lungs, not knowing that Balthazar had already ordered the soldiers to let them inside. Suddenly, Alicia also appeared at the memorial hill despite her heavy injuries. She was recuperating in the hospital, but when she received news that her brother would be executed, she immediately got up and sneaked out of the hospital while disregarding the pain. Alicia wanted to see Henry one last time just in case he wouldn't be spared. She noticed that the rest of her family were shouting desperately and quickly. Realized that it was because Henry was about to be executed. Alicia ran over to her family and asked, "Dad, what's going on?" The stewards heard her voice and immediately turned around. Donald was puzzled as he looked at Alicia, who was still all bandaged up. "Aren't you supposed to be at the hospital, Alicia? Why are you here?" "Dad, how am I supposed to just lay around when Henry's about to be killed? There's nothing you can do anyway. All we can do now is stand and watch from the outside." "Has it started already?" Donald explained. "It's about to start anytime soon, but we're not allowed inside." Suddenly, an armored soldier rushed toward the family. "His Majesty has ordered the stewards to enter the memorial hall." The stewards were overjoyed as they realized they might still have a chance to save Henry upon meeting Balthazar. They immediately rushed inside the memorial hill. The entire Stewart family knelt down on the ground as they arrived a few feet before Balthazar. They had placed all their hopes on the chance that Balthazar would spare Henry's life. Caspian would have to obey Balthazar's order no matter what. Marilyn shouted, "Your Majesty, my grandson only committed treason due to a momentary lapse of judgment. Please, I beg that you give him another chance in life." Balthazar explained, "I understand your feelings, Mrs. Stewart Sr., but I can't allow any leniency for traitors. Laws are written in blood for a reason." Marilyn explained, "Your Majesty, Henry must have been deceived into working for the enemy. He may have thought of committing treason, but he never actually did anything harmful to Diatoran." Balthazar was already briefed about Henry's crimes earlier. "I've already heard from Caspian about your grandson's close ties with the leader of the enemy special agents. Besides, he had also incited chaos within Southlake City." Donald replied, "Your Majesty, Henry may have done some bad things, but you shouldn't execute him for that." Melinda added, "Your Majesty, Henry was just confused. He doesn't deserve to be executed. You could just send him to prison and reform him for the better." Balthazar turned to Caspian and asked, "What do you think, Caspian? He didn't want to go on a killing spree?" Besides, Henry was Caspian's in-law. Killing Henry now would mean that Caspian would never be welcomed by the Stewarts ever again. Caspian felt helpless. He also knew that he would be burning bridges with the entire family if he were to execute Henry now. He wouldn't have thought about executing Henry had he not become a traitor to his own country. Committing treason was a severe crime that would have Henry wound up imprisoned for at least a decade, even if he were to be spared. Sparing Henry's life now would also cause the Archers and the Hudsons to protest against the unequal treatment. Caspian didn't answer Balthazar's question just yet, as he needed to think of a foolproof strategy. The Archers and the Hudsons seemed to regain a glimmer of hope as they watched Caspian hesitate. They realized they could also beg Balthazar for mercy if Caspian were to spare Henry's life. The Stewards stared at Caspian as they awaited his answer. Henry also looked up at Caspian with renewed hope. He would be safe so long as Caspian spoke up. Jerry suddenly laughed. "Lord Caspian, it must be disheartening to find out that one of your own had become a traitor. But then again, you can always spare him as the Diatoranian god of war." Caspian could tell that Jerry was being sarcastic. If he were to spare Henry's life, Jerry would surely make a fuss about the matter later. Chapter 664, Unforgivable. Caspian wouldn't be able to answer to his own soldiers if he were to spare Henry. Furthermore, he wouldn't be able to answer to all of his fellow comrades who had fallen in battle. There was still a mobilization session to be held, and sparing the traitors would surely dampen the morale of the soldiers. Caspian finally replied, "Your Majesty, I believe that we should execute all of the traitors, Henry included. Only then can we send off all of my fellow brothers in arms who had fallen in peace." The Stewarts, the Archers, as well as the Hudsons, were all horrified. They felt nothing but despair as they realized Caspian wouldn't even spare his in-laws. The small glimmer of hope burning within the Archers and the Hudsons were completely extinguished. Henry turned pale white as he collapsed onto the ground. He realized that he wouldn't be getting out of this alive. The ups and downs in life were unbearable. Melinda shouted, "You're too cruel, Caspian. You're a cold-blooded murderer." Marilyn added, "His Majesty had already spoken up." Yet you still insist on executing Henry. Are you just trying to bring down the Stuarts, Caspian? Donald explained, we may not have the greatest relationship, Caspian, but you shouldn't be enacting revenge like this. The Stuarts began to throw insults at Caspian. Caspian declared, I have nothing to say to all of you. I've always turned a blind eye to everything you've done. But I will absolutely not forgive Henry for committing treason. Alicia begged, but Caspian, Henry isn't such an evil man as you think he is. He had also kept me safe in enemy hands. My brother has a kind soul deep inside. Please, spare him. Of course he would have helped you. Your siblings. But what did he do to Willow? He even assisted the enemy special agents to try and assassinate her. Why would I keep someone like him alive? Alicia was left speechless as what Caspian said was true. Melinda explained, Lord Caspian, please spare Henry's life for Willow's and our sake. You can just imprison him for his crimes instead. Marilyn begged, Lord Caspian, you can lock Henry up for a decade if you'd like. Just please don't kill him. Caspian remained silent. He realized he had to stand firm on such matters. Caspian never wanted to execute Henry if not for the crimes he had committed. Marilyn turned to Balthazar and begged, Your Majesty, Henry's our only male heir in the family. Killing him would also mean killing off our entire lineage. You could just put Henry in prison for the rest of his life. We only ask that you spare his life. She just wanted to keep Henry alive for now, no matter what. She could always reduce Henry's sentence in the future and eventually bail him out of prison. Carl had been standing behind the Stuarts the entire time, unable to say a thing. Balthazar replied, Mrs. Stuart Sr., you should understand that the soldiers who had sacrificed themselves to protect the country had families of their own as well. Your grandson's treachery has ended the lineage of so many others. If I were to spare Henry today, how would I answer to the families that had lost their husbands or their sons? The Stuarts fell silent as they realized there was no hope left. Suddenly, Jerry laughed and commented, You should make your decision soon, Lord Caspian. We still have the mobilization session on schedule. Caspian realized that he shouldn't delay any longer. Willow, I need you to bring your family out of here. He didn't want Willow and her family to witness the execution as it might be unbearable. I understand. Grandma, let's go. Willow stepped forward to help Marilyn off the ground. The Stuarts burst into tears as they called out to Henry. Henry! Henry had already accepted his death and didn't want his family to be so saddened by his passing. Don't cry, Grandma. I made a mistake and betrayed my own country. Don't blame Caspian for any of this, you guys. Treason is a very severe crime after all. And Caspian had the duty to uphold such laws as the Diatoranian god of war. Everything he's doing is for the benefit of the masses. I'll see you guys sometime later. The Stuarts cried louder and louder after listening to Henry's parting words. Even Willow couldn't help but shed a tear. They refused to leave the place as they still wanted to see Henry. Caspian had no choice but to order his armored soldiers to escort the Stuarts out of the Memorial Hill. The archers and the Hudsons were horrified and began to cry as they begged for mercy. Please spare us, Your Majesty. Your Majesty, please give us another chance in life. Your Majesty, Caspian is just doing this to take revenge on us. The archers and the Hudsons begged for their lives but to no avail. Ready your weapons, on my mark. Caspian no longer wanted to listen to their screams. The soldiers carrying out the execution were in position. The archers and the Hudsons shouted from the top of their lungs for mercy, while some of them had already fainted from fear. They regretted their actions now that Diatoran had managed to win the war despite being attacked by 4 different countries at once. They would have never committed treason if they knew that Caspian was so powerful that he could defeat Robert and Victor with relative ease. A single mistake had sealed their fate. Meanwhile, on a hill in Turin, Tom explained, Madam Lynch, it's already dawn. Let's take the bus to Southlake City as soon as possible. He wanted to leave earlier but was stopped by Sherry as she insisted on waiting for daybreak. She explained that the Jessops would not dare to act rashly in broad daylight. Sherry replied, Why don't we wait for a while longer? It's still too early for anyone to be on the streets. Let's wait until noon. Tom was annoyed. Stop hesitating, Madam Lynch. It's already morning. How much longer do we have to wait? He would have left long ago if Sherry hadn't insisted on waiting for daybreak. Miranda added, He's right, Madam Lynch. We've already stayed here for far too long. The Jessops may be dangerous, but they probably wouldn't dare to do anything in broad daylight. Cecilia also chimed in, Mom, I think Tom and Miranda are right. We should leave. Sherry reluctantly agreed with the majority. Okay, let's go. She could only nod her head in agreement. The four of them left the mountain and began to make their way to the bus station. Chapter 665. Tom got shot. Meanwhile, in the abandoned factory north of Turin, Fergus and Lacey had waited all night for Tom and the rest to be captured. Lacey complained, "Those bastards are useless. The entire night has passed and they can't even catch anyone." Fergus asked, "Could they have already left Turin?" "Absolutely not. There were no buses leaving Turin during the night, and our men never saw them at the bus stations either. They had already stationed their men at the bus stations and the highway, but no one reported sightings of Tom and the rest." Kent's patience was running thin by now. "Mr. Jessup, I've wasted the entire night here for nothing. Do you know how precious my time is? You'll have to pay me extra for this," Fergus explained. "Please calm down, Mr. Vega. Money isn't a problem, but please wait for my men to bring them here." "Alright, fine. I'll play along since you're rather sincere, Mr. Jessup." Kent was also just working for Fergus for the money, and he didn't really want to walk out of the gracious amount that the latter was paying him. Suddenly, Fergus's phone started ringing. He immediately picked up the call. The caller immediately shouted, "Mr. Jessup, we found them." Fergus smiled and asked, "Have you caught them?" "Not yet. They just came out of the mountains. We're currently just following them." Fergus became impatient. "Then what are you waiting for? Capture them immediately and bring them here." He wondered why his men were wasting time with the call. His men sheepishly replied, "We wanted to get it done as soon as possible, but there's passers-by everywhere. We can't possibly kidnap someone in broad daylight." "Don't worry. Do whatever it takes to bring them here. I'll clear your name later. Just don't waste any more time. Bring them here as soon as possible." "Yes, sir. I'll capture them once I see the opportunity to do so." "Do it now. Time is of the essence." Fergus immediately hung up as he didn't want to continue spouting nonsense. He then told Lacey about the good news. Lacey was overjoyed as she had been waiting for such an update for the entire night. Tom and the women were about to head toward the bus station when a group of armed men suddenly appeared on the road. They were all wearing sunglasses and hats. The four of them were terrified as they watched the men approach them. It was obvious that they were working for the Jessups. Tom and the women were surprised to find that Jessup's men would actually try and kidnap them in broad daylight. "On the ground now!" Tom shouted as he ran up toward the group of men. He wanted to defeat them before they could react. Sherry, Miranda, and Cecilia immediately laid down on the ground and did not dare move. The group of men started firing at Tom. Tom's nimble legs somehow managed to dodge all of the bullets. The group of men were momentarily surprised before resuming the attack. Gunshots rang out like cannon fire. Passers-by in cars nearby were frightened by the gunshot and fled the area. They were all ordinary citizens who wouldn't stay around when a gunfight was happening. No one wanted to be sent to an early grave. Tom managed to evade the gunshots with his unpredictable footwork before rushing toward the group of men. He then immediately launched his shadowless kicks at his target. A few of Jessup's men were caught off guard and were kicked away by Tom. The rest of the men were shocked. They began to wonder if Tom was an ordinary person after witnessing him dodging the bullets effortlessly. Tom continued his assault before they could recover from the shock. He had precisely wanted to deal with his targets quickly while they were still bewildered. It was the only way he could fight against such a huge number of armed men. Just as Tom was about to defeat all of them, another group of men appeared behind him. The second group was led by Cillian. "Tom! Watch out! Behind you!" Miranda shouted. Tom immediately turned around to find another group of men armed with guns. He was being attacked from both sides. Furthermore, it was difficult for him to turn around and defeat Cillian's group. Cillian then ordered his men to fire at Tom. He noticed that something wasn't right. They might lose the chance to subdue Tom if they were to delay this further. Tom immediately fell to the ground and rolled around to evade the gunshots. The first group of men were hit by the bullets as a result. They had never expected to be gunned down by their own allies. Cillian was annoyed but didn't have the time to think much about it. He had to bring Tom and the women to the abandoned factory. Cillian shouted, "Fire! Just shoot him! But try and keep him alive!" He wanted to capture Tom first and foremost. Tom's nimble movements caused all the bullets to miss. The first group of men would once again be shot instead. Cillian shouted, "Don't stop! We need to get him!" He continued to fire while disregarding the first group of men, who were already injured. Tom was agile, but he was already at his limit. His movements slowed down as he ran out of stamina. The next moment, a bullet was fired, making its way to Tom's left leg. Tom had wanted to dodge the shot, but it was too late. He screamed from the top of his lungs as the bullet pierced his left leg. It was hard for Tom to continue dodging the rest of the bullets. The next moment, he was shot in the arm and then in the back. Tom might have been a Tier 3 fighter, but he was helpless against so many guns. The women couldn't even react to what had just happened. Tom eventually lost his footing and fell to the ground. The group of men began to rush toward their target. Sherry, Miranda, and Cecilia also stood up and rushed toward Tom as they shouted for his name. Tom! But they were restrained by Jessup's men before they managed to reach him. Don't touch me! Miranda shouted and struggled. But no matter how hard she struggled, she could not break free from the men's grasp. Sherry and Cecilia fell into despair as they were captured. The group of men then surrounded Tom. One of them raised their gun and was about to end Tom's life. Celian shouted, "Don't shoot, keep him alive." Celian's men angrily replied, "But we've lost so many of our men because of him. Why not?" The rest also chimed in, "Yeah, he deserves to die." Chapter 666, The Full Package. Celian explained, "Mr. Jessup said that it would be useful to keep him alive for now. We'll kill him later." One of his men asked, "Why can't we kill him? He already killed so many of us. We can just gouge out of his eyeballs, send them to Mr. Jessup and get it over with. We can just kill him after." Celian replied, "If you really need to vent your anger, just beat him up for now." Tom was terrified as he listened to their conversation. He could only wonder why the Jessups wanted his eyeballs. "Help! Anyone! Save us!" Sherry, Cecilia, and Miranda continued to shout for help. They didn't want to have their eyeballs gouged out as well. But there was nobody around the area as all other civilians had already fled the scene. They stopped their cars 100 yards away from the scene, and no one dared to move any closer. Celian ordered, "Bring them into the car and shut their mouths." The women were brought into the car. Tom was unable to move after being shot and was brought into the vehicle as well. Celian then ordered some of his men to stay back to clean up the corpses before bringing Tom and the women to the abandoned factory north of the city. He decided to give Fergus a call while on the way. Fergus was running out of patience back in the factory. He immediately picked up Celian's call when his phone rang. Fergus asked, "How is it? Have you caught them yet?" Celian delightfully replied, "Relax, Mr. Jessup. I've got them." "Very well, well done. Mr. Jessup, I've lost quite a handful of men in order to capture your target." "Relax, Celian. I'll settle the matter with their families later. I'll also pay you extra." "Thanks, Mr. Jessup." Fergus hung up the call and turned to his wife. "Dear, Celian has already captured them and is on the way here. Dr. Vega, please make preparations at once." Lacey was overjoyed. "Nice! So long as we manage to capture them." Kent replied, "Finally! I've been waiting for this." He would have left if not for the promised $1 million payment by Fergus. After receiving treatment, Calum remained in the factory as well, as he wanted to watch Tom being beaten up. He would only feel much better after seeing how miserable Tom had become. Lacey nodded her head. "There won't be any further accidents." Kent sheepishly spoke up. "Mr. and Mrs. Jessup, I have something to say, and I don't know whether I should say it or not." Lacey asked, "What is it, Mr. Vega?" "Even if I helped you take out their eyeballs, the doctors at the hospital wouldn't necessarily be willing to operate on your son once you bring them over." Fergus asked, "Why not?" "Established hospitals are very strict about surgical records. They would question you about where you sourced the eyeball from. If you can't give them a satisfactory answer, they won't perform the surgery for you." Lacey said, "That makes sense. Then, what should we do?" Fergus commented, "Are we going to give up after all the troubles we've gone through?" Kent explained, "Relax. I just felt that it was something that I needed to clarify. Why don't you bring your son over? I can handle the entire operation from start to finish instead." Fergus asked, "Are you sure, Mr. Vega?" "Of course. If I can surgically remove eyeballs, then I can transplant them as well." "That's great. I'll bring Blake over, and we'll perform the surgery here." "Sure thing, but there are still plenty of preparations to be made as I don't have the equipment necessary for the surgery here. And, one more thing, I'd have to charge extra for the high-risk surgery I'm about to perform." Kent only had one goal in mind, and that was to make a profit with his skills. Fergus asked, "Of course, Mr. Vega. How much do you need?" Kent replied, "How about this? I'd like to have $3 million for the entire package. I guarantee that your son will be able to live a normal life once all of this is over." Fergus replied, "Very well. So long as you can heal my son back to normal. I'll even pay you tenfold if you want." Lacey added, "Then, what are we waiting for? Let's bring Blake over here already. You should also bring along all the equipment that Dr. Vega needs for the surgery." Fergus nodded and drove off to the hospital. Tom was placed in a different car due to his injuries. while Sherry, Miranda, and Cecilia were put in another. His wounds were still bleeding profusely, but none of the men bothered to patch him up. Miranda realized that the situation was getting too dangerous and decided to call Willow for help. Any longer, and they might be in danger. However, Miranda couldn't make the phone call in front of these men. She decided to send a message instead. Miranda hoped that Willow would see the message and notify Caspian about their circumstances so that Caspian would come and rescue them. Meanwhile, in Southlake City Memorial Hill, the Hudsons and the Archers were crying their hearts out with regret. Caspian had yet to order his men to open fire as he still wanted to speak with Henry. "Don't blame me for being heartless, Henry. Your crimes are irredeemable." Henry replied, "I don't blame you at all, Caspian. It was solely my own fault for ending up here. I've always wanted to go against you, and I eventually ended up working for the enemy. I've made plenty of mistakes throughout my life, but none had ever been so serious as committing treason. I'm glad that you understand. What I don't understand, however, is why you Stuarts are always on my tail. I've never gone out of my way to provoke any of you. It's probably just jealousy. You were known as a good-for-nothing back then, remember? And now everyone finally realized that you're the Diatoranian god of war. I probably did all those things out of jealousy." The Stuarts held a grudge against Caspian for a reason. They feared that Caspian might bring them down, so they constantly bullied him, which only led to Henry's current demise. Chapter 667 Deserved. Caspian was puzzled. Shouldn't the Stuarts be proud of me for being the Diatoranian god of war instead? Why would you guys be jealous? Henry replied, "It's too late to talk about it now, Caspian. Now that I'm about to die soon, I have two things I'd like your help with, as long as it's not something excessive or illegal." Henry explained, "Don't worry, I won't be making any excessive demands. I only hope that you will look after the Stuarts after I'm gone." His only concern was his own family. Henry was worried for them, as they had always been causing trouble for Caspian. Caspian replied, "I'll look out for them even if you never told me to. Even if Willow had cut off ties with the Stuarts, they're still her family. I'm always willing to help if the Stuarts run into any troubles. The Stuarts are good folks. They remained loyal to Diatoran even though I kept pestering them to defect to the enemy. Not a single one of them agreed to my stupid idea, and they even taught me a lesson back then." "Relax, I already know that." "I see. I still have another request. I hope you will help my sister find her way in life." The most important person to Henry was Alicia herself. Caspian asked, "What do you mean by that?" "My sister had blindly married Richard back then. I hope that once this is over, she will move on to live a better life. I only hope you can help look after her however you can." Caspian nodded and replied, "I won't meddle with her relationships. She'll have to work through it herself." Suddenly, Jerry stepped forward and said, "How much longer are you going to have a chat, Caspian? You can just let him go if you don't want to kill him." "Stop! Wasting everyone's time." Caspian knew that Jerry was just doing this on purpose whenever he found an opportunity, but he wouldn't forgive nor spare Henry for committing treason no matter what. "Goodbye, Henry. Maybe in another life you'd live a peaceful life where you don't have to worry much about your family." Caspian turned away as he couldn't bear to see what would happen next. "Thank you, Caspian. I wish nothing but happiness for you and Willow." "Fire!" Caspian ordered. Dozens of gunshots rang out, and both the Hudsons and the Archers fell onto the ground. Henry would soon join them on the floor. This was the fate of the traitors who had betrayed their own country. The Stuarts fell into despair as they listened to the gunshots from outside the Memorial Hill. "Henry! Henry, my grandson! My son!" Marilyn, Donald, and Melinda all shouted from the top of their lungs. Marilyn was so distressed that she fainted afterward. "Grandma, what happened?" Both Donald and Willow were shocked when they saw Marilyn collapsing to the ground. "Grandma, are you all right?" Willow asked as she shook Marilyn's arm. Marilyn was unable to respond. Carl shouted, "We need to bring her to the hospital." Willow nodded and replied, "Yeah!" She handed over Marilyn to the Stuarts' housekeepers and tasked them to drive her to the hospital. The next moment, Willow's phone received several notifications. As she was occupied with sending Marilyn to the hospital, she ignored them, thinking they were just spam. After placing Marilyn in the car, Carl turned back to Willow and said, "You should go and console your uncle and the rest. I'll take care of your grandma." Willow nodded her head. "All right." The Stuarts needed to be consoled now more than ever. Donald and Melinda were wailing after their only son was executed. Willow could only try her best to help calm them down. Meanwhile, inside the Memorial Hill, the soldiers were shocked by Caspian's actions. They realized that the Diatoranian god of war wouldn't bend the law for his personal gains. Even if the accused was part of his family, Caspian would not show any leniency to criminals. Citizens outside the Memorial Hill had also learned that the Hudsons and the archers were executed for treason. They were all both shocked and impressed by Caspian's resolute judgment. Caspian felt a mix of emotions as he could tell Henry truly realized his own wrongdoings. But it was too late. Jerry noticed Caspian's sour expression and was overjoyed. Balthazar also noticed Caspian's sorrows. "I'm very touched, Caspian." Caspian calmed himself down and replied, "Let us continue as per our schedule, Your Majesty." He had led thousands of troops into hundreds of battles, and had long been accustomed to witnessing the death of the people he cared about. Plenty of soldiers had sacrificed themselves in battle. He had already gotten used to it. Balthazar announced, "Very well, we'll be holding the rally next." Caspian ordered his men, "Clear the bodies, we'll be holding the rally soon." The armored soldiers began to clean up the scene and move the bodies of the traitors away. However, Henry's body would be given back to the Stuarts instead. That was because both the Hudsons and the archers were all wiped out, while Henry still had his family to return to. Citizens outside the Memorial Hill were overjoyed as both the Hudsons and the archers were executed. "Look, the traitors are finally dead. Finally! I never expected the Hudsons and the archers to become traitors, but they've finally paid the price for their severe crimes. We Diatoranians would never forgive traitors. Nobody forced them to defect. Diatoran is already a powerful country with vast land and resources, yet they still let greed cloud their own judgment. Now, they pay with their lives." The Stuarts cried even louder when they saw Henry's body being delivered to them. "Henry! Henry, my son! Brother!" Donald's family knelt down beside Henry's now cold body as they cried out for him. Henry was still alive just a few minutes ago, but now, he would no longer respond to their calls. Melinda almost fainted from the shock. Willow felt a mix of emotions as she watched the family grieve for their dead son. She never expected things to end up like this. She had grown up alongside Henry, yet their lives were drastically different. Grieving for Henry's passing, Willow didn't have the time to check her phone for notifications. The traitors' corpses were finally removed from the scene. Caspian then stood before the soldiers, raised his arms and shouted, "Attention! The rally will now begin." Chapter 668 Payback. All of the Diatoranian soldiers stood still in formation and saluted. Tanks and rocket launchers placed around the Memorial Hill fired toward the air. The South Airdlands anti-missile system was already in place to monitor enemy attacks during the rally. Even though it was a time when the soldiers could finally relax, they still had to remain on high alert just in case anything were to happen. Balthazar, the Diatoranian god of war, Benjamin, John, and many other senior officers were inside the Memorial Hill at this moment. If the enemy were to launch an artillery strike on the Memorial Hill at this moment, the damage to Diatoran as a whole would be immeasurable. Diatoran would fall into chaos if anything were to happen to both Balthazar and Caspian. The country would be leaderless, and it would be susceptible to all sorts of threats. Therefore, soldiers at South Airdlands remained on high alert as they had to ensure that Balthazar and everyone inside the Memorial Hill were safe. Countless fighter planes were hovering above the Memorial Hill for extra measures. Caspian announced, "We'll begin with a speech from His Majesty." Everyone stared at Balthazar, awaiting his speech. Balthazar stood in the center as he looked upon all the soldiers. "My fellow men, you've all fought well. You've defended your country from Astronia, Vedesia, Philin, and Estria. 4 invaders at once. My brave soldiers, you're the reason we've managed to secure victory against these 4 enemies. We'll continue to grow as a country, just as you'll continue to grow alongside your allies. There are many amazing accomplishments deserving of commemoration and many heroic acts worth remembering forever in the Battle of Southlake City. For example, the Inspector General's team. Chief Sanders had led her own men into a fight to the death with enemy troops to defend Southlake Hospital at all costs. Her heroic actions had bought time for our medical personnel. They're also heroes worthy to be remembered and praised for their sacrifices. Joey and her men were also present for the rally. They were all very excited when they heard Balthazar praising them. Joey never imagined herself being praised directly by the king himself. Balthazar continued, "There's also the special agents who had infiltrated the enemy lines in order to secure important intel crucial to shift the tides of war. Their bravery and sacrifice had contributed greatly to our victory. Their efforts in the shadows are also deserving of being rewarded." Lena and the rest of Task Force Rose were not inside the Memorial Hill. They were all dressed as civilians and listened to the speech from outside. They were all overjoyed to hear that Balthazar had praised them for their contribution and efforts to the war. Not just anyone could be praised by the king. Balthazar understood that he could not expose the identity of the special agents he had just mentioned. Their identity still needed to be kept a secret for future operations. We Diatoranians united as one, and through immense determination and will, we've finally driven all our enemies out of Diatoran. However, the world isn't exactly peaceful just yet. Our enemies will soon return, and we must be fully prepared. Diatoran had survived as a civilization for thousands of years. Rather than keeping to ourselves and getting invaded by enemies, I say it's about time we take the initiative instead. Balthazar continued his speech with passion. Enemies of Diatoran will be punished, no matter how far they are. Our enemies declared war upon us and killed so many of our own, and we'll make them pay for their sins. Caspian then raised his arms and shouted, "An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Anyone who dared to make an enemy of us will be dealt with." All of the soldiers raised their arms and chanted Caspian's words. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The soldiers' roars could be heard from outside the memorial hill, rousing up all the nearby citizens. The Stuarts were shocked by the immense shouts and stopped crying. Willow was also surprised by how powerful the shouts were. She never knew that her husband could be so domineering. Willow couldn't help but respect Caspian even more after what she had just witnessed. A nearby civilian speculated, "Does the king mean we're going to launch a war campaign?" "Sounds like it. Since our enemies already declared war upon us, it only makes sense that we fight back." "Yeah. And this time, we'll beat our enemies into submission. We'll show them who's the boss." I'm sure Astronia, Videsia, Phileron, and even Estria must be shaking in their boots right now. The citizens outside the memorial hill began to discuss Balthazar's next steps. Once all four enemies were defeated, Diatoran would sit at the top of the world, and no longer be threatened by other countries. Willow suddenly remembered about Marilyn being sent to the hospital. She pulled out her phone and called Carl. When Carl picked up her call, Marilyn had just been wheeled into the emergency room. Carl asked, "What is it, Willow?" Willow asked, "Dad, how's Grandma?" "She's inside the emergency room right now. I don't know about the details yet. I'll come and have a look." Carl reassured her, "It's fine. You should stay with your uncle and the rest of the family." "All right, let me know right away once Grandma is out." Willow hung up and put away her phone. She never noticed the messages the entire time. Willow looked over at Donald, Melinda, and Alicia. Although they had already stopped crying, they seemed depressed as they stared at the memorial hill. Balthazar continued his speech with a hint of anger. "As the king of Diatoran, I swear to avenge all of our fallen soldiers. We must destroy our enemies." Caspian then raised his arms and shouted, "Destroy our enemies!" The soldiers chanted in unison, "Destroy our enemies!" Their shouts once again sent a shockwave across the memorial hill. Even the soldiers operating the fighter planes hovering in the air could hear their chants loud and clear. From Caspian's perspective, the rally was just a show to scare their enemies. It was a message for them to pay compensation for war, or they'd face the wrath of Diatoran. But Balthazar had a more direct intention in mind. He truly intended to crush all of the enemies that had attacked Diatoran. He couldn't and wouldn't take back what he had just said as the king. Chapter 669, Emergency. Kenzie was also captured but was not yet executed. As the head of the Videsian special agents, Diatoran still wanted to squeeze some information out of him. He was currently being held captive in a very secretive location. He was spared for now as he still had value to Diatoran. Meanwhile, in Turin, Tom, Miranda, Sherry, and Cecilia were still on their way to the abandoned factory. Miranda had sent Willow a couple of texts. She'd been anxiously waiting for Willow's reply. She waited for a very long time, but there was never any reply. Miranda realized that something might be occupying Willow's attention from reading the text messages. She wanted to make a phone call, but Jessup's men would be able to hear and stop her. Angering the men in the car now might cause them to open fire instead. Sherry and Cecilia were similarly terrified as they could already guess what would happen to them. They would soon arrive at the abandoned factory. Miranda racked her brain for ideas but realized that asking Willow for help would be the only option. But judging from the current situation, she realized Willow must have missed her messages. Waiting any longer would only be placing themselves in danger. Thinking about having her eyeballs gouged out, Miranda was terrified. She had no idea but to take the risk and call Willow. Miranda only needed to draw Willow's attention to her texts, and didn't necessarily need to talk over the phone. She had to risk her life now in order to survive certain death. Miranda stopped hesitating and called Willow's number after toggling silent mode. Meanwhile, at Southlake City Memorial Hill, Willow was completely focused on the rally. That was until her phone started ringing. Willow pulled out her phone and saw that it was a call from Miranda. She had not seen Miranda ever since the war broke out in Southlake City. Thus, she accepted the call without any hesitation. Willow wanted to check in on Miranda since she was an invaluable friend and the vice president of her company. "Miranda, where are you?" The call was hung up before Willow could even finish her words. Willow was left puzzled. She then tried calling Miranda back. Meanwhile, in Turin, Miranda's phone call was soon noticed by the Jessup's men. "You bastard! Trying to call for help?" One of the men snatched her phone away and slapped her. A clean, crisp sound rang out inside the car. Miranda's face was branded red with a handprint. She became distressed, wondering if she would still be making out of this in one piece. All Miranda could do now was to pray that Willow would read the texts she had sent. Both Sherry and Cecilia were stunned as they watched Miranda being slapped. Sherry asked, "What are you doing? How dare you?" "Shut the fuck up, I can slap whoever I want. Do you want to be next?" The man angrily shouted as he raised his hand again. The next moment, Sherry's face was also similarly branded red with a handprint. Cecilia shouted, "Mom!" Another loud and crisp sound rang out within the car as the man silenced Cecilia with her own share of slap. The driver of the car asked, "What's going on back there?" "This fucking bitch tried to call for help, so I had to teach them a lesson. We're about to reach the factory soon. Watch over them, and make sure they don't cause any trouble." Suddenly, Miranda's phone started ringing. The man ignored the phone call and just shut off the phone. Meanwhile, Blake was brought to the abandoned factory. He was not fit for discharge due to his current condition, but the hospital had no choice but to do so when Fergus demanded it. The doctors had no idea that the reason Fergus insisted on bringing Blake out of the hospital was for an eyeball transplant surgery. Fergus had also set up a simple sterile environment for the surgery. Blake asked, "Dad, have you really caught them?" Fergus explained, "Of course. Why else would I be bringing you here?" "That's great. What about the asshole who hit me? Did you catch him as well?" Fergus nodded and replied, "I did. I caught all 4 of them. I'll have to humiliate them to relieve all the hatred in my heart. Do whatever you like. They won't be making it out alive anyway." Meanwhile, in the Southlake City Memorial Hill, Willow made another phone call to Miranda but was instantly declined. She tried again after a while and was met with a system message that her contact's phone was already shut down. Willow furrowed her brows as she realized something was wrong. She tried to call Miranda a few more times and was met with the same system message. Willow took a good look at her screen and finally noticed the texts from Miranda. She opened them and was utterly shocked when she finished reading them. "Willow, Tom and I are in trouble in Turin. We're captured by some people who want to gouge out our eyeballs. Please send Caspian to help us, or we're done for." The text was clear and concise. Miranda didn't have the time to explain the details as she had to sneak in the text when the men weren't looking. Willow was utterly confused by the text. She could only wonder who had captured Miranda and why they wanted to gouge out her eyeballs. Turin was a relatively big city, and finding them would be quite a difficult task. But she was sure that Miranda was in deep trouble from the texts alone. Willow thought about showing Caspian the texts and asking him for help. She needed his help to deal with the current emergency and save Miranda. The rally was still ongoing. The armored soldiers slowly lowered the urns of all the fallen soldiers. Willow realized that she shouldn't cause a commotion right now, but she didn't want to delay saving Miranda any further. She decided to walk straight toward the entrance to the Memorial Hill. One of the guards stopped her and asked, "Lady Willow, how may I help you?" They recognized her but still had to stop her by the entrance with the special occasion ongoing inside the Memorial Hill. Willow stopped and replied, "I need to talk to Caspian." She could not just barge in at will. "Please wait right here, Lady Willow. I'll report it right away." "Okay, please be quick. It's an emergency." "Yes, ma'am." The guard nodded his head and ran inside the Memorial Hill. He arrived before Caspian and reported, "Lord Caspian, Lady Willow wishes to talk to you." Caspian replied, "Tell her that I'm busy right now. I'll look for her once I'm free." Lady Willow mentioned that it was an emergency and that she needed to talk to you immediately. Chapter 670, Important Information. Caspian was slightly annoyed. "Alright, fine, bring her in." He was not in the mood to think about other matters, but he couldn't reject Willow if she insisted on talking to him now. 2 minutes later, Willow was brought in by the guard. She had to be scanned with a metal detector before being allowed inside, which took considerable time. It was a necessary procedure, seeing that there were many big shots and important figures inside the memorial hill at this moment. Willow approached Caspian and whispered, "Honey, I need to tell you something in private." It wasn't convenient for the couple to speak right then and there with everyone around. Willow also didn't want to talk about Miranda's plight in front of Balthazar. She didn't want Balthazar to think that Caspian could be distracted at such an important occasion, leaving a bad impression as a result. Caspian explained, "What is it? Just tell me about it here. I still have matters to attend to." He couldn't just leave the venue when the rally was still ongoing. "It's something really urgent. I don't want to say it here with everyone around." Caspian noticed that she seemed anxious and walked to a nearby corner. "What is it? What happened?" Willow explained, "Miranda and Tom got kidnapped." "What? Who kidnapped them?" "I received a text from Miranda saying that she and Tom got captured by some people who wanted to gouge out their eyeballs." Caspian asked, "Who's trying to harm them? Where are they right now?" "They're both in Turin now, and that's everything I know. Miranda sent me SOS texts, hoping that you could come to their rescue." Caspian recognized Tom's name from back when Miranda mentioned him. Meanwhile, Miranda was an invaluable friend and ally to Willow as the vice president of the Southlake Corporation. Since they needed his help now more than ever, Caspian wouldn't stand idly by. "Do you have an address? Where are they being held captive in Turin?" Willow replied, "I don't know. Miranda didn't include an address in her text. I tried calling her back but her phone was already shut off. I'm worried that they're already in danger. We need some time to pinpoint Miranda's location. I'll send my men stationed in Turin to rescue them." It was too late and too far for Caspian to rescue them himself. But luckily he had some men stationed in Turin. They would be able to make it. Meanwhile, outside of the Memorial Hill, Lena's phone started ringing. It was a call from her subordinate, Arya. Arya was stationed in Turin and had made the phone call to make a report. Lena immediately retreated from the crowd before picking up the phone call. "Hello?" Arya sounded extremely urgent. "Captain Lena, I have a report for you." "What is it?" "Speak up!" "I've found the whereabouts of Lord Caspian's biological mother." Lena's face lit up with joy from the great news. Caspian had been calling Lena to speed up her search for the past few days. Task Force Rose had finally returned with good news. Lena asked, "Where is Lord Caspian's biological mother?" Arya explained, "She's in Turin, but she seems to have encountered some trouble." "What is it?" "She offended one of the powerful families in the city and was just kidnapped by them." Given the urgency of the matter, Arya only explained the important details. Arya calmed herself down and shared all of the information she had unearthed with Lena. Last night, Sherry and her daughter Cecilia were driving home from the farmer's market when she bumped into a Maybach that belonged to Blake Jessup, the son of a real estate tycoon in Turin. Blake became furious and wanted Sherry to pay him compensation for the damages to his car. But Sherry couldn't afford it, to which Blake began to insult and humiliate her daughter instead. In the heat of the moment, a man named Tom rushed over to the scene and beat up Blake and two of his men. As a result, one of Blake's eyes was blinded. The Jessup family sent out people to seek revenge on Tom but were all defeated instead. Sherry and Cecilia joined up with Tom and a woman named Miranda. They then tried to escape from Turin. Jessup's men eventually tracked them down, and a huge battle ensued. Tom was shot and all four of them were kidnapped, seemingly being brought to an abandoned factory north of the city. Arya reported all of her findings in one go. Lena was surprised. "Why did you only report such an important matter now?" Arya explained. "I had just finished my investigation right before I made this call." The shootings happening on the relatively remote road in Turin had attracted Arya's attention. She quickly launched an investigation, and had only just pieced the events that had occurred together. The most shocking detail was finding out that one of the kidnapped women was Caspian's biological mother. Arya realized the gravity of the situation. She didn't dare to take matters into her own hands, and decided to report it to Lena instead. Lena asked, "Why are they targeting Lord Caspian's biological mother?" Arya explained some more details. "As far as I know, it's because Blake wanted to gouge out all of their eyeballs. Then, he'll pick one of them to replace his own damaged eye. But of course, hospitals in the city would never perform such a surgery." Blake's father, Fergus, then decided to spend millions of dollars and hire a private surgeon to perform the surgery behind closed doors. Lena angrily shouted, "Bastards, they dare harm Lord Caspian's family?" Arya replied, "They probably have no idea who Sherry is. No matter what, the Jessup family is committing a crime. Just who are they?" Why do they dare to do something so cruel? Arya explained, Fergus Jessup is the current head of the Jessup family. He's the real estate tycoon I mentioned earlier. He's also the richest man within Turin. But his wife, on the other hand, is even more powerful than him. Lena asked, what's the deal with his wife? Fergus's wife is Lacey Andrews. She's the daughter of a high-ranking official named Jerry Andrews.